Greetings from Seattle, Washington, in the heart of Cascadia. I'm Jason Rigdon, and you are listening to The Podcast of Mystery, the show that always leaves you with more questions than answers, the podcast where I talk with extraordinary guests about the paranormal, the strange, and the unknown. On this episode, controversial guest Brian Platt returns to the show to tell us all about communism. I'm sure nobody will get upset about this episode. It's not going to be like the last time Brian was on, right? Now, you know how other paranormal and conspiracy podcasters say we don't talk politics here? Well, I think those folks are liars and cowards, and probably fascists. On the Podcast of Mystery, we recognize that everything is political. You want the military to disclose their information about UAPs? That's political. You want to ban hunting and killing cryptids? That's political too. You want to talk about how Hillary killed Jeffrey Epstein, John McAfee, and Vince Foster? That most definitely is political. Or maybe you think things are just fine the way they are right now and you don't want any changes. That might not feel like a political stance, but it is. You are standing in opposition to those that do want those changes. Now, I don't want this show to descend into the mundane minutia of the 24-hour news cycle. I'm not very interested here in the fake battles between the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States. I am interested in how we run our society. I am interested in alternatives to the way things work right now. How will our civilization evolve politically in the future? Which new ideas will be adopted? Which old ones will be rejected? What will our political systems look like in the future, and what should they look like? That's why I want to start talking to folks about alternative political philosophies on here. I want to challenge my listeners with different opinions, and as always, leave them with more questions than answers.
I'm Brian Platt. Look, Jason, I'm going to say this. I'm your first return guest.
Yes, friend of the show.
Friend of the official.
Is friend of the show second or third?
Official friend of the show status, you know. But yeah, I'm one of the co-hosts of the Mechanical Freak podcast, formerly Seattle Sucks. No, I can't explain why we changed our name. Nobody knows. That's the true conspiracy. You can find us on any of your fine podcasting apps, or you can find us at mechanicalfreak.website, which seemed like a funny URL to get at the time, but is impossible to explain to people.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, returning to the show today. And you know what we're here to talk about today is just a little bit about communism. It's an incredibly large topic, so I'm going to ask you to do the impossible. Could you give us the briefest introduction to what communism is?
Yeah, so communism sort of is spawned from, Marxist political economy, right? And it is essentially putting that political economy into practice with a political program designed to bring about a communist society, right? So, and the general idea is that capitalism is a society of class oppression and class antagonism, where the working class, or people who have to sell their labor in order to survive, are being exploited by the capitalist class, who controls the means of production in order to extract wealth from those who don't. And communism was the idea of overthrowing that class antagonism, creating a working class state where the working class held political and economic power as opposed to the capitalist class, with the end goal of eventually bringing about a new social and economic system that was not based off of class exploitation and the selling of commodities for profit, but was based off of a Marxist formulation, to each according to need, from each according to ability.
And are communists the same as socialists and anarchists? And is the Democratic Party communist?
Yes, our communist leader is Joe Biden. And no, I mean, the Democratic Party, of course, is not communist. It has an explicitly capitalist ideology. It actually is, in the realm of sort of the political theories that you could put under the umbrella of capitalism. It's actually pretty far to the right. I mean, it's always funny in America when you hear about the Socialist Democratic Party. I mean, by international standards, the Democratic Party would be the far right party of any, in any European context, in Japan, et cetera, right? The Republican Party would just be completely off the chart, essentially. It's so far to the right. I mean, it has, in Europe, in places like Germany and stuff, where you have 8 viable political parties, like the Republican Party wouldn't even be in that like it wouldn't exist even in that context. So they have 8 parties, one of which is almost explicitly Nazi, still has policies much to the left of the Republican Party. um, but the Democratic Party would certainly, I mean, and this is actually shown historically. I mean, when the Tories were opposing Corbyn, Obama actually, this is in England. So Corbyn's the Labour Party leader, which would be considered the sort of liberal left party of England. And the Tories, of course, are the conservative right wing party. So if you wanted to overlay American politics onto it, it'd be like the Labour is the Democrats, the Tories are the Republicans, except for the fact that when Corbyn was in charge of Labor, Obama and several Obama aides actually intervened on behalf of the Tories, urging people to vote against Labor, right? So explicitly took the side of the right wing party in England. They did the same in France, again, taking the side of the explicitly right wing nationalist party in France in recent French elections. So yeah, I mean, the Democratic Party believes in what we call neoliberalism in the language of sort of capitalist politics, which is the idea that the market should control all interactions, that it is the best arbiter of the division of resources. Therefore, there should be no hindrances put on it, like things like, I don't know, the minimum wage, safety standards in work, trade policy, all that kind of stuff should largely be eliminated. So the Democratic Party is actually a pretty far right wing capitalist party by just the standards of parties that exist today. Um, Now, as far as what's the difference between socialists and anarchists, without diving or delving too deep into the social history and philosophy of these organizations, um, anarchism is a almost pre-capitalist formation. It comes essentially from rebelling peasants in Europe, and it's this idea of creating loose, in theory, classless federations of, workers or peasants who essentially, in the words of the punk band Choking Victim, have no gods, no masters, right? So the idea being that it would be totally horizontally organized with where, everybody just kind of does their own thing. Now, of course, all the anarchists get mad at that description, but that's, more or less it, right? Um, Socialism, of course, there's a great, history of socialism in the 19th century, going up into the 20th century. And when the distinction was made between socialists and communists, which we could say is like Lenin and the Bolsheviks break with the Second International, um, the difference between socialists and communists was largely based around how to get to a communist society, and socialists believed you could get there through electoral politics, right? Without having to engage in revolutionary struggle. That they would essentially have the workers vote them into power, at which point they would enact socialist policies, right? So housing reforms, land reforms, etc., which of course would then just further legitimize them, and eventually through the process of political change, the society would be transformed into a communist society, right? Whereas Lenin and the Bolsheviks basically said, well, that's not actually going to happen because capital represents an actual powerful class with interests. They actually control the state, and they will intervene on your efforts to try and elect yourself into power in the state. And they'll intervene in lots of different ways. Maybe they'll just change the rules of elections so that you can't win, or maybe they'll take away the franchise of workers so that they can't vote for you, or maybe they'll just kill you, right? But either way, you're not going to be allowed to just walk into power. They would agree with the old Frederick Douglass adage, regarding slavery in the US, that you can't just legislate slavery away because power concedes nothing without a demand. You have to actually take it. They're not just going to hand it to you. And so the difference between socialists and communists was that communists believed that power essentially would have to be seized by the working class. It would never be granted, given, or voted into existence. And therefore, you should build your political parties around that idea that eventually you are going to have to actually take power and wield it on behalf of the working class. Now, where people get sort of mixed up in all this is that, of course, as communist parties actually operated in power, they did run socialist economies, right? And that they still had markets in a sense. I mean, they still paid people in money and all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, which is different than the end communist vision. So in that ideal, right, the communists said, well, we have to seize power. The working class has to seize power. Then we enact socialist reforms. We build a socialist economy on our way towards communism, right? Of course, is the thing that you know the one thing that hasn't been accomplished. I will say is the communist ideal not been accomplished.
So these sound like radically different ideologies and political organizations. Why do so many people kind of lump them all together?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, again, I mean, we have to remember this that we're sort of in the American context, and the biggest reason in the United States that they all get lumped together is that when you study the American left, there's always this sort of joke about how everyone in the American left is always hot to do something, but never hot to read anything. Like there's always been a little confusion about what constitutes actual politics and stuff like that. That's that's part of it. The other part is that in the United States, we've been subjected to a 100-year long propaganda war launched in the 1920s. It was essentially when the Cold War actually began. That has done everything in its power to uh, dissimulate, hide, obfuscate, make opaque or difficult to understand what any politics outside of a very narrow spectrum, which is represented by the Republican Democratic Party, actually is, right? So to obfuscate what communism is, to obfuscate what socialism is. And to give just a quick example, I was working in a machine shop one time, and I remember I had this coworker who was, I can't remember what was going on. Something was happening that he was interested. I think it might have been the Haitian earthquake. And so I gave him this communist newspaper that had like an article on it. And he told me, well, I can't read that. And I said, why not? And he goes, well, I'm not a communist. And I said, oh, yeah. And he says, no, I'm an American. you know, and I said, well, like the United States has had a lot of communists in it. I mean, we even had a communist party at various times that's been very powerful, like had large membership and stuff. And he's like, really? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, oh, okay. And then he took the paper. Right. So, as far as his understanding from obviously what he was told in school and all this, communism was simply the act of not being American. And to be an American was to not be these are exclusive categories. It just piercing that bubble a little bit just to be like, I mean, this is written by Americans who say they're communists. And he was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I can take it. you know, the long and the short of it is the Cold War has fundamentally warped all of our brains.
Yes. Yes, that's one reason why I, really want to talk about communism is because it is such a important part of the 20th century. And I feel like the 21st century really has been just trying to figure out what the hell happened to us during the 20th century. Along those lines is that, like you're saying, that this country, United States, used to have, lots of communists. The right constantly talks about cancel culture and censorship, but it's hard to find too many other political ideologies that have been canceled and censored as much and persecuted as much as the communists in this country.
Yeah, and I mean, it's this interesting part of our history of, I mean, not only were people persecuted at the time for being communists, but their existence has been essentially completely erased. So we, of course, live in Seattle, and in Seattle, we had the first ever general strike in this country in 1919. And that general strike was launched in large part after dock workers found that supplies of weapons were being surreptitiously shipped out of Seattle into Russia, where U.S. soldiers had been deployed to put down the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, every part of that sentence is probably an enormous surprise to a lot of people listening to that. I'm sure that most people here are not aware that the United States invaded the Soviet Union with 17 other countries in 1919, and actually, held garrisons in Archangel and I believe Vladivostok. Um, that all the warring powers of World War One in Western Europe, all basically on a dime joined sides and invaded the Soviet Union after the invasion. They're probably equally surprised to hear that this had some part to play in the Seattle General Strike, which I'm going to go ahead and venture a guess that also most people are not aware of. And so, after finding this cache of weapons being surreptitiously sent to the eastern, side of the Soviet Union, uh, dock workers in Seattle who had a long list of grievances beyond just, their support for the Soviet Revolution, um, basically said, "Fuck it, we're going on strike." They went to the Central Labor Council and basically got all the other unions on board, and there was a general strike, meaning that all elements of organized labor, including elements of that weren't officially within the realm of organized labor, all went on strike, right? And essentially shut the city down. When they did this, it was actually a really interesting story. I mean, for 2 weeks, they created their own like milk delivery systems, their own newspapers, all this kind of stuff. They essentially ran the city. The mayor of Seattle fled the town. Hilariously, went to New York to raise funds for the war against Bolshevism in Seattle. Said that he was, at one point he said that he had his own shotgun for retaking the city. Uh, Fraternities at the University of Washington were deputized to put down the strike. Um, again, all these like fun details. I believe it's in the Seattle, might have been the Seattle Intelligencer at the time. They had this whole article about how they were going to hang the communists from lampposts and all this. A lot of these themes are going to come back. We're going to hear. Um, but yeah, so they essentially went on strike in solidarity with workers in the Soviet Union, but also, to fight for workers' rights in the United States. The strike was eventually undermined through a conscious campaign of playing white workers against Asian workers and, all the usual shit. Police roundups of people. It led to what's called the first Red Scare, where all over the country, dissidents were rounded up and thrown in prison. Many were deported, including some who comically had spent their entire lives in the United States and just found themselves on a ship, heading usually to Eastern Europe. Um, but yeah, there was a mass roundup of dissidents. It also a young uh, police agent at the time named J. Edgar Hoover was one of the primary architects of what became called the Palmer raids. He was an assistant to this DA named Palmer. And the FBI essentially is going to be the whole infrastructure of the FBI is going to be built out of this period of the first Red Scare. Kind of an important moment, right? But in Seattle, we have no idea of this sort of history. I mean, it's not really taught in schools. It's not talked about. There's not really like, I mean, try and find a memorial for the Seattle General Strike anywhere around here, right?
Yeah, I do find it interesting that you will have certain right wing politicians that will be claiming, that Joe Biden is a communist, and then in the second breath they'll be like, "What this X like being banned on Twitter is equivalent to McCarthyism," without any hint of maybe irony is not the right word, but how do you know what McCarthyism was?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, we talk about the political repression of communists, it's we say the political repression of communists, but it's actually a political repression of any what's considered left deviant thought. So people who are rounded up in the Palmer raids and the first Red Scare, some of them were communists, right? Like probably a good chunk of them. Some of them were just guys who were pro union. Some of them were people they just didn't like. When we get to the second Red Scare, which begins actually in the late 1930s and continues most famously into the McCarthy era of the late 40s and early 50s. Again, there's people being called in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Uh, Definitely some of them were communists, right? Some of them were just, again, pro labor advocates and things like that. But it didn't matter because the sort of anti communist impulse is never really about just stomping out communism. It's about stomping the left generally, right? And the end result has always been a weakened labor movement and a weakened working class in the United States. So after the first Red Scare, which begins in 1919, unions really are at their weakest point in the late 1920s in the United States. And it's because their leadership had largely been arrested and deported, essentially, right? Some killed and things like that. Again, stuff that hilariously we don't talk about at all in this country, but things like the Centralia massacre just south of here, um, where a IWW Hall, which IWW is an anarcho syndicalist union that was organizing timber workers, was raided by a group from the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, which was created as an explicitly like fascist street gang to beat up peaceniks during World War One. Now it's just elderly people on their last leg, but not its origins. Um, but yeah, they tried to raid at IWW Hall to essentially, who knows, beat the shit out of, maybe kill the members in the IWW. Something that happened very frequently in the Pacific Northwest. IWW members had been forewarned of this eventuality, so they were not in the hall when they showed up. And essentially, a firefight ensued between IWW members who were on the other side of the street from the hall and the VFW members that were trying to raid the hall. Uh, Several people died. Afterwards, all the IWW members that could be found in the city and those who they thought were sympathetic were all rounded up, put in prison. One of them was then literally beaten to death and then hung off a bridge. They cut his corpse down eventually and put it in the cell with all the other IWW members while they awaited trial, all of which I think got like 30 or 40-year sentences. Um, this that's cancel culture. All right. Like that's what it means to be canceled. All right. And that is what people on the left in the United States faced as far as, repression. So when we talk about the Red Scare and stuff like that, we're not saying, oh, this or that guy, like under McCarthyism, wasn't allowed to make movies. It wasn't just that. It was people were thrown in prison for the rest of their lives. People were killed. People were, lynched. And, for working class people, one of the things that could happen to you too is you could just be permanently blacklisted from all work, which is really difficult, to live with in a society where you have to work to live. Right. So yeah, it's the right complaining about cancel culture today is always very funny given their history of let's just say canceling people permanently.
So the right wing is still trying to oppress people who they call communists or people just generally on the left. And what's interesting to me is how oftentimes they do it to people who aren't communists, who aren't on the left. You already said that Joe Biden is not a communist. One of the more amusing things I hear is when people claim that Bill Gates is a communist or that, Twitter or Facebook are ran by communists. Is that true? Are these all secretly billionaire communists?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing that the richest people in the world are somehow all communists, and you just wonder where the money came from, right? And I mean, I think it speaks to the sense that the Cold War diluted the term, right? Now, in the 1940s and 50s, when the campaign, really got underway to essentially label communists this and that, right? So, in the 20s, you just all communists were Jews. That was the American position, right? you know, maybe you're an American Protestant born in Seattle. Doesn't matter. You're a foreign-born Jew because you're a communist, right? In the 1940s and 50s is when because of the eventual revelations of the Holocaust, something the U.S. tried to repress during every stage of the actual Second World War. They wouldn't allow reporting on the Holocaust and all that kind of stuff. Something we can get into later if you want, but after the Holocaust, the revelations of the Holocaust in 1945, it suddenly became a little gauche to say, all the communists are Jews enacting a Jewish conspiracy, therefore we should probably kill them all. Uh, that all of a sudden had a different tone, right? Didn't hit people's ears the same way it did in 1920, right? Uh, so they moved from saying Jews to anti-American conspirators, right? Generally from some other area. So at that time, you would have never accused, the richest man in America, Henry Ford or whoever, of being a communist, right? Like there was still this remnant of an idea that Americans understood what communism was. But through this sort of massive campaign to sort of label communism as just as just un-American, right? There's two categories: there's being an American and communist, right? That all got so muddied that it just became, well, communist is just anything you don't like. You know, you don't like raisins in your cookies. Well, a communist. You don't like, you don't like Joe Biden. Well, he is a communist or whatever. And so with Silicon Valley, I mean, for a lot of these tech billionaires, even in the realm of capitalism, I mean, under capitalism, the capitalist class, everything is contested amongst themselves, right? So they have rivalries, they have fights, right? They don't get along, all this kind of stuff. And so there's plenty in the capitalist class who don't like the fucking tech billionaires, right? And so because they don't like them and they're just searching for something to say about why they don't like them that isn't just, I wish I had those billions of dollars instead of Bill Gates or whatever, they just say communist, right? Now, if we actually look at the history of Silicon Valley and the California ideal, which was created in the 1970s, it is actually like comically and thoroughly embedded in the libertarian tradition, which is the idea that capitalism works best when there actually is no government at all, which you might recognize as maybe being the exact opposite of communism. It is actually this sort of form of hyper capitalism where it's essentially just capitalists saying we shouldn't be bound in even the tiny ways that we are, right? So, yeah, we can violate labor law at will. Yeah, we can exploit workers at will as much as we want, but we should also be able to fly to pedophile islands without being shamed for it, you know? And that's the position of Bill Gates, as people are, as we've reported on Mechanical Freak and Seattle Sucks since 2019 when we started, but people are just now coming to find out that is Bill Gates's position. But that is, I mean, I don't know anybody in tech who doesn't have like a far right libertarian, sort of view of the world. Now, for other capitalists who also have similar views, who but are losing the sort of fight to accumulate as much money as possible, uh, you know, they need something to throw at these guys. So I guess they're communists. I guess because they're bad. I don't like them. They're bad. They're communists. The nice thing about calling somebody a communist is you never have to explain anything. You can just say they're communists, and you know that nobody's ever going to ask you why or how does that make sense or anything like that. It's just an epithet you can throw out, and it doesn't require any sort of explanation. So you could say Joe Biden's a communist, but you know that there'll never be a question about, well, what policies of his, like specifically, do you think are communist? you
Yes.
know.
Yeah. Or something that, I've done previously is, just asking people to explain what communism is or why capitalism is good. I have one popular episode for another show I did where he literally said that communism wasn't good because no communist nation has ever produced a corporation like Amazon.
you know, um, at the tail end of the Soviet Union when it was falling apart, of course, there is in the Soviet intelligentsia, there's all these people who are really itching for capitalism, right? Because they saw that people in their position in America, they saw were making a lot of money, and they thought that that was due to them as well. And one of the things was they hilariously asked, why does the Soviet Union have a Ministry of Culture? America doesn't have a Ministry of Culture, and their culture is great. It's like, cool. Yeah,
Yes.
it's awesome. Let me tell you, living in it, it rocks. But yeah, you know, it is this sort of interesting thing because yeah, I mean, if you were to ask the average American, like, what is communism? I mean, I think the blowhards would probably go on for 20 minutes in some nonsensical rant about God knows what, that would be like that meme of Charlie Day with all the string on the board, basically be the verbal equivalent of that. But I think most people just really struggle to come up with anything, like, if you ask like for like details, they'll just tell me people you don't like, the names of people you don't like. Give you some details, right? They might really struggle. And the funny part about that is the only thing that Americans struggle as much with is if you ask them to explain what capitalism is, right? Like what it is, how it functions, right? And this was me too. I'm not, saying that I'm smarter than anybody.
I mean, they're hard questions. They're hard questions. But if you're using it as an insult, maybe you should have some kind of meaning behind it.
Yeah, they're hard questions, and they're hard questions about things that you're very specifically never told and never have explained to you. Like in
Yes.
school, you can take an entire economics class in school and have zero ability to explain what capitalism is after it's done, right? Because it's mainly just piles of bullshit on excuses and all this kind of stuff, right? Um, you could take an entire class in college on philosophy where maybe you cover talk about Marx or something like that, and just be completely incapable of explaining Marxism, as many were, including myself when I first took one my freshman year or whatever. But it's you know it's one of those things that we don't talk about these ideas. Also in the United States, we have a very prescripted view of politics. Most politics is considered outside the arena of the average person's, outside their arena of action or thought, right? So when you talk to most Americans don't vote, right? And if you were to ask them why you don't vote, they'll tell you it doesn't matter, which is true to some degree, but it's basically saying that they feel that they are outside the world of politics, right? That's a club they're not allowed into. And because of that, they don't spend a lot of time and energy worrying about it, right? Uh, as you wouldn't if you were totally cut out of it, right? And economics is the same way. I mean, most Americans, including some of the wealthiest ones, hilariously, have a really hard time explaining how the economy works, what their role in it is, all this kind of stuff. To give a quick example, I had a friend who was working at the MoHI here in town, the Museum of History and Industry. Jeff Bezos had funded this exhibit that I think is still there. It's like right when you walk in. Had funded this exhibit on innovation, and apparently the mandate for the exhibit was literally a history of innovation. Right? When people said that is meaningless, what do you mean? He then had he had his people or whatever there to explain it, of course, to the historians that were there. Uh, this is specifically what we want. And so basically what he wanted was an explanation of how he, Jeff Bezos, individually had, with no help from anybody, created Amazon. And that's why it's great, right? Um, and so to sort of make a long story short, my friend had to do these write ups. So Bezos people had picked these, it was like 6 cities, and you were supposed to, and they wanted write ups explaining why each city became an innovation capital. And so it was hilarious mix of places. Like Seattle was one, Silicon Valley, Detroit, and then hilariously ancient Rome. uh, yeah. Oh God, where else was it? I think uh, maybe like Memphis in ancient Egypt or something. And then or somewhere in Africa, I can't remember. But again, another ancient society that was like, it was just funny to try to explain, like, these are like wildly different economic and social systems and whatnot. But the funny part was about all of them, what was true about them was, oh, the reason why they're quote unquote hubs of innovation is that the state launched huge programs in those cities to one, draw people to them, and two, to essentially facilitate the funneling of wealth upwards, right? So in ancient Rome, they had a policy that every ship that came to port, they would take all the documents, any written materials off that ship would be taken. And then they would, maybe, if they got around to it, give you copies back, but they would take it and then eventually store it in various libraries and things like that, which is an amazing information transfer program that they had. That is just one of the many thefts of the the Roman Empire was engaged in. But to get more toward the actual capitalism in the United States, Detroit became this zone of innovation, which is true because, the state had invested in building up the auto industry. and it had been built in Detroit because of land giveaways from the city and from the state of Michigan. It was built up because they had a well organized union labor force, and then it fell apart because they wanted to break the unions, right? Silicon Valley was built entirely on defense spending money from the federal government. All those places out there are all run essentially tax free. So that's all, again, giveaways from the city and stuff like that. Up here in Seattle, again, defense spending is the key factor, right? I mean, forget that the federal government is why you can live in Washington and California in the first place, through Indian removal and things like that. But, the military spending is why there's tech in the Puget Sound area. It's because of Boeing attracting so much military money. They attracted military money and put themselves in Seattle because it's right next to a shit ton of military bases, all this kind of stuff. Well, anyway, so this person did the write ups explaining how, like, the state essentially creates innovation centers through spending tax dollars, essentially. And Jeff's people got very mad at this, and they said, "No, that's not what we meant. What we meant was tell us the heroes from these areas who built things out of their garage or whatever." And it's like, well, that didn't happen. Like that's all myth making. That's not real, you know. But you could guess what placard ended up in the Mohi. I'll tell you that.
Well, you talked a little bit about folks using being against communism, but not really knowing what it is or why they're against it. It sounds like you are kind of against capitalism. Could you tell us why capitalism is bad? Once again, a gigantic topic. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism fundamentally at its core, right, is a class society based off the antagonism of the capitalist class and the working class, right? And um, you know, Marx has this great line where he basically says, uh, labor is forced to sell its commodity to capital in order to live. But the good economist says yes, but capital is forced to buy labor in order to make its products or whatever to secure surplus value. And so they meet in the marketplace as equals, one a seller and one a buyer, right? One ready to buy them, the other ready to sell its hide. And and Marx has this great line where he says, and of course, when you meet as equals, force prevails, right? So the real question is, on what side is force? And this is the fundamental problem of capitalism and the system of exploitation it has is, as a worker, I am forced to essentially sell my labor. That doesn't mean that laboring in and of itself is bad or anything like that, or even the job that you do is bad or anything, but it does mean that you're being exploited at it, right? And by being forced to sell your labor, and with capital having the power of the state behind it and the power of accumulated wealth behind it, they can afford to buy that labor as cheaply as possible, right? To force you to sell it cheap. And so, if I'm at the widget factory, I might make $100 of widgets, but the capitalist can tell me I'm only going to give you $10, in pay in exchange for that. And then the capitalist secures the other 90, right? And surplus value, right? Now, the reason why this is bad in the long run is it creates a very small group of capitalists at the top who accumulate all the wealth and value of society, and a large group of exploited people at the bottom who are then controlled through a superstructure that capitalism builds around itself to maintain its power, which is police departments, the military, legal structures that make things like, not working illegal, which was, some of the first laws in the United States was laws against not being employed, things like that. So if you're living off the land, they'd be like, nope, tough luck. They need you in the factory, right? Uh, Legal superstructures like the creation of chattel slavery, right? Things like that. It also creates ideological superstructures, in fields of education, right? As well as, through the media or whatever, that are essentially constantly force feeding you an ideology that this is actually all normal, good, and okay. And, you know, what ends up happening is workers, they're on the, and by the way, this was, you don't have to actually read Marx to understand any of this. Adam Smith actually talks about this quite a bit in Wealth of Nations. And he talks about, yeah, workers and capital are always in conflict. And he's like, and capital seems to always have the power of the state at its side, that when this conflict happens, it doesn't get resolved off of the basis of arguments or negotiation. It seems to get resolved on the back of like police batons and cannons. Um, so this conflict, right? One, it sucks for you, which if you're listening to this show, look, you're probably in the working class. I hate to tell you this. No matter what your thoughts are about your actual position in society, you're probably in the working class. It sucks because it means you have no control over your destiny. It means you have no control over your life, health, anything like that, right? Your life is always contingent on some capitalists being willing to allow you essentially to live, whether they allow you to rent a house or allow you to receive pay for your work, right? It's always contingent on that. But it also creates all these instabilities in the sort of political economic system that also negatively impact workers. So if you have a system like capitalism that is based on the circulation of trade, right? Meaning that, in order for capitalism to function, people have to keep buying shit, right? So commodities have to keep getting made, people have to keep buying stuff, right? That's how capitalists, secures surplus value. And the system of capitalism, it doesn't work if people stop buying things. And we've actually had in the last 20 years two very good examples of this. And we've seen America panic in response, which is right after September 11th. Uh, you know, those of us old enough to remember might remember George W. Bush getting on TV and begging people to go shopping again, and being like, it's your patriotic duty. You have to go shopping again. And the whole thing was based off of, this traumatic event had happened in the United States. There was all this fear mongering around it that made everybody paranoid. So people started taping plastic in their windows and shit because they,
Oh gosh, I forgot about that. Yeah.
yeah, because in Lubbock, Texas, they were convinced that they were going to get a like sarin gas attack from Iraq or something. So basically, the velocity of purchasing decreased. Right, people were buying less because they were busy panicking, and it actually, I mean, we were already heading towards a recession, but it essentially supercharged a recession that we had in, it were, started right at about that point. And George W. Bush had to get on TV and basically say, Stop, go shopping, please. Like the system doesn't work if you aren't buying shit all the time, right? Um, and recently, I mean, this is what a lot of the panic articles about COVID-19 have been about, which is, should we just say I mean, this goes all the way back to the very beginning of the pandemic. Like, let's just tell people there is no real pandemic. Don't worry about it. They still have to go to work and they still have to go like buy stuff at stores and everything like that. People, weren't buying into that. So what we ended up getting from two political parties who were neither one was wanting to do this against their will, essentially mailed everybody checks, right? So, you remember getting your check. That was not to make you feel good. That was not to, uh, that was not whoops, we're sorry for bungling COVID. That was literally to keep the system running. Like they're like, look, we need to keep people purchasing. We're seeing, a decline in purchases. It is going to lead to a massive economic recession if we allow this to continue. Um, so we have to keep the, economy moving, right? And so there is this problem in capitalism that money tends to accumulate at the top. That money is required to purchase commodities. The movement of commodities through purchasing is required to keep the whole system of capitalism afloat. And poor people, working class, all of a sudden doesn't have money to buy stuff. And so the economy just comes to a complete crash. Again, we saw this in the Great Depression. It wasn't that we weren't producing things anymore, it's that literally people couldn't buy anything anymore and the whole thing fell apart. Roosevelt's solution, just give people money. Just find a way. Make up a bunch of jobs that, hey, we're going to send you out in the middle of nowhere and have you just build a road for no fucking reason. But we're going to pay you for it. Right. Create social security to like pump money into old people so that they can keep pharmaceutical companies afloat. Right. You know, this kind of stuff was all created to essentially what capitalist economists like Keynes used to call priming the pump. Right. Which is, look, capitalism is an engine. When purchases slow down, that engine starts to seize up. So we have to prime the pump to get the engine going again, right? And uh, so capitalism has these natural instabilities that cause economic crises, that cause these kind of problems. And who pays? the cost, or who pays the like bears the brunt of these crises? And it's the working class again, right? Because capitalists have money already. So if the economy tanks, even if they lose some, it's not a big deal to them. They also have the power of the state that can bail them out while leaving you out in the cold. For those of us who remember 2008, um, you know they're fine. Like their parachute is there, but working class people are the ones who bear the brunt. So we're the ones who get to die in unsafe factories because we're forced back into work. We're the ones who get to die homeless, penniless on the streets. We're the ones who get to die of COVID because they feel that they have to keep McDonald's open during the entire, pandemic, right? And, of course, when you look at mortality rates for COVID, frontline service workers are right at the top. It's basically nurses and line cooks are the two people who died most from COVID, right? And one of those you could say, look, we had to keep the hospital system running. It's a little harder to explain why McDonald's had to stay open, right? Um, so in this system of exploitation, not only as a worker are you disempowered politically, not only are you disempowered economically, not only are you forced to essentially work for a pittance of what you actually create, and you have no control over the things you create, you're also the first to bear the brunt of any of the crises the system creates. And if you're on the losing end of this bargain, which most of us are, that sucks, and you don't want it. It's not a good deal.
Do you think that we might be in the kind of the slow motion collapse of capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, I know that the American left is currently very enamored with this idea of capitalism collapsing, but you know, capitalism is very resilient. You know, it is it is always able to turn crises into opportunities, and without an opposing force, there has to be some sort of opposing force willing to fill the vacuum. There is just there's no where are we going, right? So I mean, capitalism can continue to just be stuck in a rut. I mean, from basically the 1870s all the way up to the First World War, we're in this period that a lot of historians refer to as the Long Depression, where we just had crises after crises after crises. I mean, economic depressions that were bigger than the Great Depression, right? As far as number of unemployed, like destruction of wealth, all this kind of stuff, right? We're in this period just crises after crises. And there was never any resolution out of it. Like those crises didn't create a better system or anything like that. Eventually, uh, American capitalists, one, learned that you have to have some amount of federal regulation in the economy. And the second thing they learned is that, oh, we need to exploit the third world harder to prevent these crises from happening. So they redoubled their commitment to imperialism, beginning with the Spanish American War in 1898, uh, as well as after the First World War. Um, the First World War was, of course, a war amongst the various capitalist powers about dividing up what the imperial periphery or the third world. And in the war's end, Woodrow Wilson had suggested that we should create a League of Nations, which is sometimes idealistically portrayed as this like, hey, in order to stop wars, let's form a friendship society amongst all countries. But in reality, and you could read this in Wilson's own notes, it was essentially it's like, hey, let's form a committee of imperialists where instead of fighting each other over colonies, we negotiate, right? And the American Senate actually voted down the League of Nations, which is why the US didn't join. But the American Senate voted it down, saying, no, our position, and like they're again very explicit about this. So like, our imperial position is better if we don't participate in this debating society and we just take things, right? And so the US, was on an imperial tear, throughout the 20s and 30s. Again, a lot of things that people don't know about, like, you know, one thing I was told in college, even I remember hearing this in high school and then in college. I don't know to what degree this is like a widespread story, but for some reason I kept hearing it. But I was in a geography class in college, and they showed this aerial photo of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right? And like, if you look, you could see the line like where the two countries divide because Haiti is like deforested and effectively like desertified, and the other side isn't, right? And this was supposed to be some statement about uh, the Haitians having a bad land policy, whatever. Like they were the bad grasshopper that wasn't collecting for the winter, right? As opposed to the good ants over at the Democratic Republic or the Dominican Republic, right? And the thing that was interesting about that wasn't explained at the time was that actually that the United States had invaded Haiti in I believe 1915, had occupied it all the way up through the 1930s. And during that time, particularly during the New Deal, one of the largest sources of lumber for New Deal projects in America was Haitian lumber, right? And so the US had effectively completely deforested Haiti, right, in order to essentially build, up American infrastructure. And that deforestation, I mean, when you deforest something, it actually does change the landscape. Like the trees don't just come back, right? Like you loosen the soil blows away, all these sort of problems. And Haiti's been dealing with this ever since the 1930s, right? It was the US like thirst for, cheap goods, right? That took that. By the way, in that initial invasion of Haiti under Wilson, the first thing the US did was they seized all the Haitian banks, particularly their trading houses, and stole all the money and shipped it back to New York. So I mean, that was how the US solved the Long Depression, was essentially just through like pretty disgusting imperial conquest.
So, what do you say to the kind of common argument that communism has failed everywhere it's been tried?
Yeah, I mean, when I guess let me sum up that last point real fast. So, we talked about I just, I got so excited I kind of forgot where we had begun there, but this idea that capitalism is just going to sort of resolve itself by falling apart. The reason why I don't have a ton of faith in that is I think a lot of Americans see that the American empire is having trouble, right? That it looks weaker than it has in decades past. Um, there's still not really an effective opposition to it, but there doesn't necessarily have to be like a big baddie on the block. I mean, the US stole the British Empire by just going and making deals with other countries, right? And being like, hey, the British fucking suck. You know what you should do? You should sign up with us, right? Some people see China's Belt and Road Initiative as doing effectively just that, right? Um, but yeah, I mean, the US empire looks to be in a pretty untenable position long term, and things look bad in the United States long term. And I think a lot of people in America conflate the destruction of the US empire with the destruction of global capitalism. And those are not the same thing. And if the US empire falls apart, I mean, we could have exactly the same thing the British had, which is an even more feckless, disgusting, capitalist class in charge, just handing out smaller pieces of the pie, right? Um, so, so the thing is for capitalism, just like for feudalism to collapse. I mean, feudalism had lots of uh, really destabilizing moments, really destabilizing events, but it required another system, another competing system to be there and able to take its place for feudalism to actually collapse. And capitalism is the same thing. Like it requires another system to be there, present, ready to take its place in order for it to collapse. Now, to get to your this question you just asked, about communism failing, for many in the 20th century, it looked like that was here, right? We did have a competing system ready to take capitalism's place. And the end of capitalism, as we say every decade, was imminent. um, Obviously that didn't work out. Now, why did those countries fail, though, is a separate question, right? I mean, I think in the beginning, we have to ask ourselves, did they fail in the first place, right? Which, as far as the condition of people in Russia and Eastern Europe, the rise of the Soviet Union, whatever you want to say, good or bad about the Soviet Union, improved the conditions of the vast majority of people who lived within it. Right. This is a fact not even debated by Soviet scholars or anything like that. Which the world of Soviet history in the United States is, pretty disgustingly anti-communist. Even they are like, you can't really debate the fact that like people's life expectancy went up dramatically, literacy rates went up dramatically, people's just quality of life was dramatically better under the Soviet Union. Luckily, now we also have a counterpoint to that, which is the Soviet Union then fell apart. And again, something that's not even debated in Russian scholarship is the lives of everybody in Eastern Europe got dramatically worse and has stayed dramatically worse since it's falling apart. So, in that sense, I mean, did the Soviet Union fail? I mean, it succeeded in bringing hundreds of millions of people, into the modern world in a way that extended their life expectancy and made their lives better. Some would call that actually a success. Same thing with Chinese communism. Again, for whatever criticisms you want to have of the CCP, it's not debated amongst China scholars that they did improve the lives of the people in China. I mean, the stories you hear of American and British travelers, which you can read, going to China prior to the revolution, I mean, they talk about going around Shanghai, and they would have carts, like somebody would be dragging a cart down the street, picking up the corpses of people who had died the night before, either of, living on the streets, died in just utter poverty, or people who had died from drug addiction because the British had been pumping China full of opium for 100 years. And we would just throw them on the cart. And this was just everyday life, living in Shanghai. Um, that's not how people live in China anymore, right? And the difference is the Chinese Communist Party, right? And, like I said, whatever their failings and things like that, your life, the lives of the people that were there were improved by their existence. Now, what people are really asking is why did those countries not continue existing, right? Why can't I go visit the Soviet Union today and sing the songs and do the dances and whatever? And the answer is that these societies didn't exist within a bubble, and that every stage of their life and existence was spent in pretty agonizing struggle against the West. As we mentioned before, the second the Bolsheviks succeeded in seizing power in Russia, the United States and 17 other countries invaded Russia. They also funded, armed, and gave material support to bands which are collectively called the White Army, but they're not really like a unified group. They're just bands of generals and stuff who would build up these large armies and would go around just murdering peasants in mass and things like that. I mean, the Russian Civil War, which is really the first, like, it was not really a civil war. I mean, most of the participants were from outside of Russia, but the Russian Civil War probably killed a million people. I mean, it was a very dramatically violent, horrifying war. It led to an enormous famine that would go on for years afterwards. Um, you know, those are all the things that the Bolshevik Party had to deal with in the Soviet Union, right? Um, you know, during the 1930s, they had to deal with, people again funded by Western European intelligence agencies and things like that, destroying crops, sabotaging factories, assassinating political leaders. Again, you can find out all this information by reading such communist sources as the New York Times and the ambassadors from the United States to Moscow, right? Appointed by, Roosevelt. It was some guy from he was like a lawyer from like Oklahoma or whatever, who now everybody says, well, he was just a raving communist. And it's like, what's weird that his raving communism only seemed to exist while he was in the Soviet Union, sending secret reports about the Soviet Union's what was happening in the Soviet Union back. You know, so during the 30s, they were dealing with that. They were also trying to bring a feudal society into the modern world. They weren't allowed to bring it in the way that maybe the people of the Soviet Union might have wanted, because they also had to live with the fact that they knew another invasion was coming, right? So their industrialization was totally shaped off of having to build up a massive military, which, of course, you know, as much as people criticize that choice of the Soviet Union, it turns out they were 100% right, because the largest invasion in human history happened very shortly after, and the Soviet Union repelled it, right? While the US was denying concentration camps existed, the Soviet Union beat back the fucking Nazis. The Soviet Union liberated the camps. The Soviet Union, uh, basically promoted Jews to things like general and stuff like that in the Soviet Union, something the United States wouldn't do until I think the 1960s or 70s. Um, you know, they were doing a lot, right? They defeated fascism in Europe, right? They were helping to arm the Chinese communists who did all the fighting against the Japanese army, right? None of that was done by Chiang Kai-shek, who the US supported. None of it was done by the United States, right? You know, these are all big debts, right? That we owe the Soviet Union, the Soviet people. It's also things that we forced them to go through as a country that it's hilarious to hear American leftists talk about, well, if I was there, I would have done this or that. And it's like, fuck you. If you were there, you probably would have died. You've been the first one who died. Come on. Like pretending like you have any ability to understand what these people are going through. Right. Like there's any comparable events that's happened in the United States. Right. And going into the 60s, I mean, this even during the Cold War, it's not like the fighting stopped. I mean, the US continued assassinating political leaders across Eastern Europe. They did things like everything from, you know, bombing public events, being held in the Soviet bloc, to doing things like poisoning the powdered milk supply for German school students in East Germany. You know, I mean, the level of constant aggression from the West towards the Soviet Union, I mean, it is the main factor in its collapse. I'm sorry. I mean, there's a lot of internal things that happened in the Soviet Union. There's a lot of things about the Soviet system that were problematic, but I just don't think you get the result that you had without the United States. Yeah, largely the United States, but with the help of Western Europe, constant, aggression, constant attacks against the Soviet Union. And it's just very funny how when we talk about like, oh, look at how those states collapsed, right? And all that context just gets thrown by the wayside. Forgetting, by the way, that capitalist countries collapse all the time. usually because like a natural disaster happens and they're like, oh, I guess we don't exist anymore as a country, right? Or they collapse under imperial pressure, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, the country that survived two of the largest invasions in human history and a literal nonstop attack from the West, that's somehow it must be something unique to their system of why they collapsed. Definitely none of those external factors. And I mean, the same was true for China. There's again lots of criticisms I might heap on the Chinese Communist Party or the Bolshevik Party, but I'm sorry, you're just playing pretend if you don't basically put the United States front and center at why these countries had the problems they did and why the communist systems eventually collapsed in them.
So, for people listening to us now that would like to learn more about communism, what do you have? Do you have any books or any suggestions for them? Where should they seek out to find more information?
So if you want to learn communism, you should read all 3 volumes of Marx's Capital. No, I'm just joking.
I mean, that's what I'm kind of thinking. Is like people find that very intimidating.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Parenti is a very good, and this is the key point, accessible writer on these issues. It's very hard in the West to find accessible writers on left issues. The reason is they literally can't get published. It takes a lot to be able to get published. But Michael Parenti writes very well in these things. There is she's like a historian of Bulgaria. This woman, Kristen Godsey, has written some very good books. Maybe I'll throw you maybe some notes or links or something we can put in there. But Kristen Godsey has written some very good things. She writes, I mean, the main problem in America we get, particularly on the left, when we sort of evaluate these communist regimes, as we say, well, the Soviet Union was bad because, they didn't let people travel as much as we let people travel in America or whatever, which A, it's like you don't understand how travel actually works in America. But B, it's like, well, we shouldn't compare the Soviet Union to the imperial, like the biggest imperial state, right? We should probably compare the Soviet Union to the countries that it became right under capitalism, right? We should compare the Soviet Union to modern Russia and modern Eastern Europe and all this kind of stuff. Kristen Godsey has some really good work on that, where she basically says like, look, this is how people live in Bulgaria now or live in Eastern Europe now. and this is how they used to live. These are their complaints about, the move to the capitalist paradise, right? These are the things that they are mad about, that they miss from, the communist days. These are the things that they've lost, right? And I think she very sort of aptly shows that like this has been a loss for them, right? Like their lives are worse now because of it, which I think she makes the case very well. Um, but she has several good books. One's called Red Hangover, and I think the other one is called Women Had Better Sex Under Communism or something like that, which is a funny name of a funny East German documentary as well, that is about how women now in East Germany report that sex is much worse than it used to be, uh, which is one of the many things lost. Apparently, it was good sex, but yeah. Um, so those are two good sources. We also did an episode on Mechanical Freak, that maybe we'll put a link to. I can have you put a link to too, where I walk through with my wife, because my wife's always complained I tell her stories that are really depressing and make her sad because she's right. I mean, she's not lying. She's right. And so one time I decided it'd be really funny to record it because I'm also by nature a podcaster, which means essentially an inhuman fucking weirdo. And so I essentially ran through what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union, like with life expectancies, things like that, how their government was reoriented, how their economy was rebuilt, which by the way, America plays a huge role in. And so we have an episode where we walk through all that we can give people too, because sometimes reading's dumb and boring, so sometimes you'd rather listen to it. So give me that as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and your insights. This has been a fascinating conversation. If people want to learn more about you, where should they go?
They should go to mechanicalfreak.website, and it's .website instead of .com. We thought it was funny. Nobody understands it. They keep putting in mechanicalfreak.website.com. You don't need that last part, just mechanicalfreak.website. And you can listen to our show, Mechanical Freak, our podcast, which is on all podcast platforms.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jason.
I'm Jason Rigdon, and you have been listening to episode number 24 of the Podcast of Mystery, originally transmitted on
Sunday, July 25th, 2021.
If you want more information about me, the show, or my guests, please visit podcastofmystery.com. If you have a guest or a topic that you would like to hear on the show, please email podofmystery@gmail.com. You can also send any feedback or comments to that same address. This audio program is copyrighted by me, Jason Rigdon, in 2021 and is freely available under the Creative Commons Attribution License. And don't forget to leave the Podcast of Mystery a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening.